Why haven't you come out to make it clear that Craig Wright is not Satoshi?
Could you introduce us to the current situation in Africa and its Bitcoin adoption?
And that's the thing with life. I mean, it's one of those things where, again, because the attention span is reducing with subsequent generations, honestly, like minute by minute, because of the internet, I guess, TikTok and all these things, it's hard really to stay focused. But then again, I'm glad we had these opportunities really to make it clear exactly that we still exist and things aren't still that good. I mean, the only positives I can talk about obviously is things around like people now adopting Bitcoin. Obviously, the music scene is still growing and increasing, especially from Nigeria, where we're representing the whole continent and putting on our shoulders. Not to brag as as a country, but I think those are some of the positives. But more seriously, I think to your question, the thing is again is back to the fundamental ideas that we really share as a continent, which is we need that economic prosperity for us to actually gain agency over the trajectory of our futures when it comes to individual countries and a continent as a whole. Because again, Africa is seen as a poor country, but it's super ironic because there wouldn't necessarily be colonialism in the continent if it was exactly poor. So it's one of those conundrums where people have to come to the realization that yes, Africa is a wealthy country. What do you do about that? So I think the immediate thing for us is, okay, we now have an opportunity where, number one, we had the internet come in and then decentralize the whole idea of communication really and opening up horizons to where you have, for example, I'm part of the Fulani tribe, we're nomadic people. So you have a person like me talking to someone in like some remote village in Norway or somewhere crazy. So I think that coupled with now the opportunity of Bitcoin where it's doing that exactly what the internet did for communications, but for money, I think is one of those verticals that we could easily key into and be ahead of and kind of direct exactly where the development goes and make sure that it does benefit the continent from that perspective. So I think in terms of what's going on now, more specifically on the political side, we're seeing at least now a more aggressive approach by certain countries, especially through the belt around Chad and some of these other countries where we've seen the military juntas take over. There are mixed opinions, obviously, but as far as we're concerned on the continent, it's one of those things where it's horrible to see these regimes, but at the same time, it's necessary for us to rid ourselves of some of the colonial structures we have, specifically with France, for example, where there's full-on, I'd say, economic barriers and barricades really when it comes to countries that they control and use the CFA. So I think it's one of those things where, again, bad things are happening, but sometimes not to justify anything. Let's just say it'll be better if we didn't have these structures really when it comes to prospering. But yeah, it's one of those things. And with Nigeria, we've moved through another presidential election, which means a lot of people looking for ways in which to continue the rent seeking. But for other people on the ground like myself, we're looking at ways in which we can position this new administration to be a lot more favorable to the prosperity of Bitcoin and obviously doing the work training people on the ground to know that this tool exists and how you could actually use it practically.
USDT is used a lot in Africa. How does it improve African lives at the moment?
I mean, it's a simple answer, really. People are using USDT because it's cheap access to not Bitcoin, cheap access to dollars, basically. Because the thing is, in a lot of countries with currency controls, a lot of it is aimed at really restricting forex, and that involves restricting access to the US dollar, for example. And the thing is, obviously, the US dollar still maintains the global economic hegemony as like an actual money itself. So for a lot of people, it's the most stable alternative they have to runaway inflationary currencies or debt-based inflationary currencies. So for them, it's a case where, okay, I'd like to have a money where tomorrow is not devalued by like 1,000%. And the US dollar happens to serve that purpose, but the problem is getting access to that. So that's where USDT steps in. So the majority of a lot of the trade volumes you tend to see on the ground tend to be pairs between whether it's BTC, NGN, for example, in Nigeria, or BTC, USDT. So it's really at a point where it's not necessarily a long-term holding when it comes to using USDT. It's more a short-term bridge between moving in and out of different economic, I guess, monetary systems, really. So that's kind of why it's popular.
So, why do they understand USDT but not Bitcoin?
So it's tricky. It's two reasons. One, people get accustomed to the stability when it comes to the USDT itself. Whereas with Bitcoin, for a lot of people that jump into that, it's a case where they got into USDT first and foremost to stabilize the wealth that they have before they decide to move on to Bitcoin, whether it's for savings or some other alternative. Another thing they're doing is a lot of the activity is really not crypto, to be honest. When people say crypto adoption, is actually just two things basically that's happening is Bitcoin alongside USDT. So for a lot of them, they're going from local currency USDT, stabilizing it. You can maintain maybe a couple of months. Typically, that's what people do, especially for salaries. They rather get their salary in USDT as opposed to Bitcoin. But then we still see a lot of motion between USDT and Bitcoin. So a lot of people are doing that for, again, remittance reasons, obviously savings as well. So I'd say there's a lot of interplay between the two. I wouldn't necessarily say, once you get into USDT is like the end all be all.
How do we get more Bitcoiners from Africa and Latin America to speak out?
It's a lot. So first and foremost, I'm really glad to see kind of the way things are treading. If you notice, like, and look back, a couple of conferences back, I'd say the majority of the talk on the quote unquote global south was really from people in the diaspora. And there's nothing wrong with people in the diaspora talking, but there's a level of, I'd say, veiling when it comes to the realities on the ground and what they technically understand about really what's going on. So obviously conveying that message will, one, be dated, two, it'll be inaccurate, and three, is to some extent a bit disingenuous, which I think is kind of the core to your the core of the kind of a question you're posing as well. So I think it's good to see that the folks that are on the ground are actually coming up, and I think it's going to continue because, again, we're now starting to see a lot more people have access to, whether it's tooling or at least the understanding to start working on Bitcoin. So it's a lot easier for people to say, I'm living this reality, let me try and change it. And then folks are able to see that really outside and go, hey, what exactly is going? But I think more practically speaking, for conference organizers or people that are looking to have more folks in that ecosystem coming to represent themselves would be to think really around the practicalities of actually getting to those conferences. So for one, for example, it's very, very easy for, let's say, a Nigerian to come into Europe via, a Schengen visa. But the thing is, you want to make sure that if you're looking to get these people into your conferences, you want to do it really ahead of time. So you want to explore exactly what the visa challenges are, because this is a concept that isn't exactly common for a lot of conference organizers to think, what's the visa situation? But it's a reality that we have to go through. So I think being conscious of what it takes to actually physically get folks there is one thing. Two, not everyone can afford to actually fly out. Flying is really expensive, both within and outside of Africa. So it's one of those things where you want to consider having financially cover a lot of people too that would come into that region. Otherwise, you still have the same crop of people who can afford to do it, but are totally disconnected from the reality on the ground.
Using Bitcoin implies some knowledge, like running a node. How can you teach that?
I mean, look, the thing is, there are so many asymmetries, I think, when it comes to the perception people have and the reality on the ground. There's always going to be that disconnect. But for us, it's a case where we need to be the bridge between those two and go, like you said, hey, there's no electricity, so how the hell do you want people to run their node? And two, it's a case where, okay, even if there's electricity, what about the internet infrastructure? Three, what about the cost of getting those equipments in? Four, what about the cost of actually getting things into Africa import-wise? You still have to do a lot of really interesting things, to say the least, to get things into Africa. And again, you can't guarantee that these things haven't been tampered with, a la things like hardware wallets, for example, which is a lot more difficult for people to get access to because, again, it could be tampered. They tend to be at a price point which is above what a lot of people can afford. So I think for us, it's a case where, okay, guys, this reality that we're facing is not necessarily saying that we don't want anyone else to do like the best practices possible to run Bitcoin. It's a case of saying, okay, here are the realities on the ground. How do we work with those realities to get people to that phase that we're talking about as the ideal? I don't know why I air quoted. It's actually the ideal, really, when it comes to self-custody. So I think that's really where we're looking at it. So no electricity, try and push in more mining, get folks to get involved to get to that stage. Not a lot of good internet access. Look for options when it comes to things that could work in low internet activity, I guess, regions. If there is internet access, then we're starting to look at, okay, do people have savings to begin with? How can we start teaching them about hardware wallets? Are they cheap? Are they good enough? Are they reliable? Things around that. So I think it's a mindset shift. It's also a case of just letting people know that that's not how things work.
Should governments be involved in this process?
I think they should. I mean, and I think we're going to see a lot more governments get involved, specifically from countries that are a lot more, I say, collaborative or at least altruistic, which tend to be the ones with the smaller populations. Because again, the fewer the people, the more you tend to care about the populace, really. So I think it's going to be a case where, yes, they should help out, but the ways in which they should help should be not exploitative, and it should be putting, I guess, what I say, people at their interests really front facing, as opposed to like dictates from WEF or some other organization to dictate exactly how you should be doing this. Because the thing is, at the end of the day, you still need government involvement when it comes to, again, laws. At the end of the day, we live in practical realities. If you live in a place where you want to mine, but then getting a permit is virtually impossible, specifically for that, you have to collaborate. So I think we do have to. Being risk averse to governments and the potential for rot makes sense. But at the same time, we also have to be practical and pragmatic, really. We can't just say, fuck the government. We're trying to build on their land. And it's like, can't have it both ways.
How can we get them interested in this?
I see a variety of ways. It's ironic. So without like doxing specific governments or people in specific agencies, a lot of people forget that people that work in government are also human beings. They're family members, they're aunties, cousins, uncles. So they actually tend to also use Bitcoin. So it's one of those huge ironies where because of the hierarchical structures of some of these governments, they just need to convince the higher ups or someone who's higher than them with kind of a convincing argument that everyone would get, comfortable with why they're doing what it is really when it comes to regulation in general. So I think it's obviously appealing to the greater benefit as opposed to saying we like Bitcoin, it looks cool. If you adopt it, you also be amongst the cool nations. No, it's a case of people are suffering economically speaking. These are the ways in which Bitcoin can help. If you really care about the people, these are the ways that you could help it, and it happens to be with Bitcoin. So make it a lot easier to use. I think like guilt tripping, education, all of that works really.
If there is one question you could ask Satoshi, what would it be?
Oof. Why haven't you come out to make it clear that Craig Wright is not Satoshi?
Okay. What do you like the most about Lugano so far?
I'd say the people. It's really friendly. It's pretty. I like friendly people, so I'm happy to see that. Oh wow. Okay. Well, that's good news for everyone who's using Bitcoin and the USDT. I say your first trip where you're in Switzerland or at least this part of Europe will be Lugano.